With so many options, why choose Arizona State University?
For me, the only online option was ASU because of the quality. Their faculty was really involved with their students and care about your personal journey. The dedication to my personal development from my professors, that's been extremely valuable to me.
Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Explore more than 300 undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
You are now listening to the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network.
Greetings and welcome to the audio commentary track for Solomon King, a 1974 independently produced black action film that has rarely, if ever, been seen since the 1970s and has now been rescued from deep, deep obscurity by Deaf Crocodile and is presented here in this restored version. Now, the fact that you're watching this ultra rare film and that you're listening to this commentary certainly would indicate that you have a curiosity about not just the big hits of the so-called blaxploitation boom, but also the deep, deep cuts of this genre. And so I think you're going to find that the story of how and why this picture was made and who made it and how this picture fits into the bigger picture of black cinema and racial politics of its time, I think you'll find it to be a fascinating story. And on top of that, this movie is just a lot of fun to watch. Although it really wasn't intended as a comedy, I think we'll see that the film does have a sense of humor about itself. And if it were ever to be reborn as a midnight movie, I think it would be a hit with that type of an audience. My name is Steve Ryfle, and I've written a number of articles about cinema and civil rights era politics for Cineast magazine. I'm also the co-author of a biography of the Japanese film director Ishiro Honda, and that was published by Wesleyan University Press. And I'd like to start this discussion off by spending a little time talking about a man named Sal Watts, the man who conceived of this movie and who serves as its co-director, screenwriter, producer, and who plays the lead, the title character, who in a few moments, whose name we will see emblazoned across the front grille of a beautiful Maserati coupe. There were, of course, a good number of African-American actors, directors, producers, writers, and so forth, who had been empowered and inspired in the late 1960s and early 70s by the changing nature of racial politics in the United States. And of course, I think they were also inspired by the fact that the image of the perfect black man, Sidney Poitier, had since given way to a different kind of hero played by people like Jim Brown, Richard Roundtree, Melvin Van Peebles, Ron O'Neill, Fred Williamson, and other people, action heroes who stood up to the white power structure and won on their own terms. Solomon King, of course, draws its inspiration from the famous blaxploitation movies like Shaft and Sweetback, Slaughter. But what I think sets this film apart is the fact that Sal Watts, a total unknown, had the ability to come out of nowhere and pull off this project essentially in DIY fashion. Here's Sal behind the wheel of his Maserati, a very appropriate secret agent type car, and it looks like he's driving through the hills on the east side of Oakland, although so much development has occurred over the past 50 years that it's difficult to pinpoint some of the locations in this film. So Sal owned notably several men's clothing stores, both in Los Angeles and in the city of Oakland, where this movie was, of course, shot on location and where Sal lived in the early 70s. But this is the only film that Sal ever made. He did appear in at least one other film that we are aware of in a small role. But consequently, there's really not a tremendous amount known about this person. Thankfully, Deaf Crocodile secured an interview with Sal Watts' widow, Belinda Burton Watts, and thanks to her generosity, as well as a few other sources, we'll try to tell a bit of his story. By the way, Belinda Burton Watts appears briefly in this film in the very final scene aboard an airplane. She plays a member of a Middle Eastern royal family who's seated next to Solomon King and strikes up a conversation with him. Well, here in these opening sequences, we can see some of the trappings of low-budget indie filmmaking, and perhaps a bit of evidence that this was, to a certain extent, a non-professional or semi-professional production. In the credits, you may have noticed that the second lead, the character of Manny, whose name we heard repeatedly in that opening action sequence, "This is Manny, this is Manny." He's played by little Jamie Watts, a name that sounds like nepotism was at work in the casting. If Manny is Solomon King's brother in the film, then perhaps little Jamie Watts was Sal Watts' real-life brother. Well, actually, James Watts was not a blood relative, but was in fact one of Sal Watts' best friends. And many people who worked on this picture, both in front of the camera and behind it, were friends and business associates of Sal Watts, which is, of course, part and parcel of low-budget filming of any kind. You get by with help from your friends. You may also notice occasionally some less-than-ideal camera work, some abrupt or unusual cutting from time to time, and to be frank, the acting in the film is not always the most polished or professional. Interestingly, there's heavy use of off-screen dialogue to lay out the plot points of the film, and that could be a bit of a giveaway that there were some holes in the script that had to be plugged after the fact. And there are a number of sequences that are, shall we say, time killers, for lack of a better description. There are 2 lengthy musical numbers in a nightclub. Then later, a lengthy dance party sequence on the docks of the Oakland Marina, which is something to behold. It's just a wonderful random non sequitur, which is immediately followed by a commando raid on a beach. There's a scene where Sal hits fungos to some kids on a baseball field. There's an extended belly dance sequence. None of these things move the plot along, of course, but they do make the film longer. Speaking of that scene on the baseball field later in the movie, there's a cameo in that scene by Tito Fuentes, who was an infielder for the San Francisco Giants baseball team at that time, and who's now one of the Giants' Spanish-language play-by-play announcers, incidentally. Tito Fuentes was a friend of one of Sal's employees in his clothing stores, and it just shows you so many people in this film are friends and friends of friends and family. Samaki, the female secret agent who you'll meet later and who is assigned to follow Solomon and keep him safe, she was an employee of Sal's clothing business. The kids that you're going to see on the baseball field and in a chicken restaurant, those are Sal's children. There's a white woman, who lures Solomon into a trap at a nightclub. That was Sal and his wife Belinda's real estate agent. And the guys who try to assassinate Solomon, those were Sal's personal friends. Many of the locations are Sal's own businesses, his homes, his office, but he also rented locations around Oakland when needed, and he shot with permits as required. The Maserati that you saw just a moment ago, that belonged to his then-girlfriend and later wife, a present he had bought her. So altogether, you can see why this film has a real DIY feel to it. Here's another example of that disembodied dialogue. But truly, for all its low-budget limitations, Solomon King is a really ambitious film. It's a really ambitious story idea. This film was made in the midst of a worldwide energy crisis that provides the backdrop to the story. You'll hear one of the characters later ask, "Haven't you heard of the oil crisis?" And in fact, the recent P.T. Anderson movie, Licorice Pizza, also uses the same oil crisis of the early 1970s as a backdrop to that story. Coincidentally, in 2022, as this commentary is being recorded, we're living through another international energy crisis with gasoline prices hitting all-time highs in the United States and around the world. But in October 1973, which would have been around the time this movie was in its formative stages, the Arab nations that belong to OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, they decided to cut oil production and limit exports to the West in protest of America's support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War that year. This created a series of what were called oil shocks in America and around the world as supplies quickly dropped and there were shortages of gas and oil. Prices went way up. From 1973 to 74, the average price of a gallon of gas in the United States rose from 39 cents to 55 cents. The horror! President Nixon instituted a gas rationing program to safeguard supplies. And in some states, you were able to buy gas for your car on odd or even days of the month only, depending on the numbers in your license plate. In places like Los Angeles that are heavily dependent on cars, there were long lines at gas stations, cars spilling out into the streets for blocks. This is when the U.S. really started having a national conversation about its dependence on foreign oil. The oil crisis of 1973 to 74 was really the first significant American economic crisis since World War II and the uninterrupted prosperity that we'd experienced since then. It pushed our country further into a period of recession, and there was unprecedented inflation in the 70s, again, much as we're experiencing right now. As much as the Watergate scandal and the downfall of Republican President Richard Nixon, it was these economic issues that also led to the election of Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, to the White House in 1976. Here we are taking a walk through what I believe is the park next to Lake Merritt in downtown Oakland, but again, things have changed a lot over the years, so it's hard to be 100% sure. And we're coming up on one of the first great violent action scenes in the picture, a real treat.
The princess is my responsibility, and I intend to protect her.
Let's briefly summarize the plot, because there may be a few details that aren't clear when you watch the film. The story begins in a small fictional Middle Eastern country run by an oil dynasty, and Hassan, the nephew, I believe, of this dynasty, he hatches a plot to kill the king and take over the country himself. Hassan is played by Richard Scarzo. He's the shirtless, evil gentleman yelling into the camera who opens the film. Looks like he's auditioning for a production of Aladdin. Solomon King and his right-hand man, Manny, apparently have oil interests in this Middle Eastern country, owing to some heroic deeds that Solomon performed there to rid the country of subversives, quote-unquote, when he was a CIA operative a few years ago, a job that he's retired from now. Then there is an assassination attempt on Princess Oniba and the king at the oil field. That oil field is supposed to be in the Middle East, of course, even though there's no location titles on screen, but it was surely filmed somewhere in California, as there are oil fields with pump jacks like the ones you see in the film. So then Manny evacuates the princess to the United States, where she stays at the posh hillside home of Solomon King, rather than under any official government security arrangement. Of course, the young princess has always had a big crush on Solomon, and now they fall in love. Meanwhile, there's a dirty CIA agent named Weinstock, played by actor Warren St. Thomas, who had a number of credits in sexploitation films, and he kind of looks like Shemp Howard in a leisure suit. Weinstock is working for the evil Hassan, and Weinstock hires an assassin to kill the princess. And even though Solomon admonishes the princess to stay inside his house under lock and key, she's rather easily shot to death on the balcony. So then Solomon and Manny search for the assassin, and eventually there's a big foot chase and a gunfight in the streets of Oakland. There are attempts on Solomon's life. Manny does a lot of violent ass-kicking. Solomon has a dalliance with a lovely CIA agent assigned to protect him, and it all ends with Solomon fulfilling a promise that he had made to the princess to restore her father to the throne. Solomon and a bunch of his ex-Green Beret buddies on a mercenary mission to the Middle East storm the beach by night, arriving with apparently just one inflatable raft, and in a sequence apparently inspired by films like The Longest Day, The Dirty Dozen, and The Guns of Navarone, they storm the royal palace, which looks like stock footage of a castle in Scotland. The bad guys defeated, the king is restored to the throne, which we learned from a newscast, and Solomon heads home. And at the end of the film, there's hints of a new mission for Solomon that might lead to a sequel.
Bring them. Solomon, I didn't have time to do anything at all. I was so confused.
This is one of the only extended dialogue sequences or extended monologues in the film. Claudia Russo, the actress playing the princess, she's an actress that was cast out of Los Angeles. She doesn't appear to have other credits. She does a very good job of portraying the princess as rather childlike. She's apparently someone who's been kept in a palace and has not had the opportunity to go out and live amongst the people. It's questionable whether this film is culturally accurate with respect to the scenes involving the Arab nation and its people. If she were to belong to a Muslim faith, it's doubtful that she would be allowed out of the country without an official escort, and it's also doubtful that she'd be allowed to dress in this way. You'll also notice that in the scenes taking place in the Arab nation, this being an extremely low-budget production, the sets are dressed with what looks to be Persian rugs hanging on the walls to give it that Middle Eastern flavor. But I do appreciate Claudia Russo's performance in this scene and in other scenes. This film has a sense of humor about it. You'll notice in the morning when she's making breakfast for Solomon, she being a woman, again, who hasn't much experience in the real world, wanting to please Solomon, goes all out, put flowers in a vase, and is attempting to wrangle a toaster and other pots and pans at the kitchen stove in order to cook him what appears to be a pancake breakfast. And it's actually a funny little scene. By the way, that box of Carnation Instant Breakfast on the counter, which was a packet of powder that you mixed in a glass of milk, I think that's the 1970s in a nutshell. Quentin Tarantino, P.T. Anderson, they can recreate the 70s gloriously using modern film technology, but there's no such substitute for the real thing in all of these little details. Now, Sal Watts said that he made this film in response to complaints in the black community about the content in blaxploitation movies. In January 1975, he was quoted in Box Office magazine saying, quote, "Solomon King doesn't have a lot of sex and dope, but it does have a lot of action," unquote. And indeed, there is no nudity, and the main character isn't a gangster or a drug dealer or a pimp, as in some of the other films of this type. Solomon King is closer to Shaft or Robert Hooke's character in the movie Trouble Man, in that he's firmly part of the black community, but he also knows how to navigate the white world without being reliant upon it. He's a good guy. He has a respectable past serving his country, but he's chosen to go his own way now. And there's an effort also in the film to show his material prosperity, the Maserati, the nightclub business, the oil fields especially, and this big home. The film seems to show that he's achieved these things by being a good guy rather than an outlaw, which is more of a positive message overall. Sal Watts' birth date is a bit mysterious, but apparently he was born possibly in or around 1940. Some reports from back in the day indicate that he might be a few years older than that. So he was either in his mid-30s or a little older at the time that this movie was made. He was originally from Canton, Mississippi, and according to the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper, he served in the U.S. Army from 1958 to 1962. Belinda Burton Watts relates that Sal was perhaps involved in covert operations of some sort, and he claimed to have been a driver for General William Westmoreland, who commanded the U.S. forces in Vietnam from 1964 to 68. She also believes that Sal may have learned to speak the language or dialect of the Hmong people, who are an ethnic minority in Vietnam, who were recruited by the U.S. to fight against the Viet Cong. So it's entirely possible that Sal's military service may have ended later than 1962, and that he served in Vietnam, although we don't really have verification on these points. Sal was reportedly seriously injured in a football game with some of his white army buddies, who hit him so hard that he suffered kidney damage and had to have one kidney removed. And he lived that way until later in his life when he had to begin dialysis treatment. Sal also apparently felt that He wasn't promoted to higher rank despite his exemplary service because of the color of his skin, but nevertheless, he is said to have loved the military and his time in the service. Maybe we're reading a bit into this scene, but it would seem that the princess, freed from the confines of a restrictive society and a royal family life, is just really enjoying being outdoors and being at the beach. And Sal, though, despite his duty to protect her from very dangerous forces, and both of them have discussed this, he's taken her to a place where she's very vulnerable, and he suddenly realizes that here. Now, Sal had only an 11th grade education, but he actually did a lot better in life than many people with MBAs. It's not clear exactly when he arrived in California or even where he first settled down, but he did apparently own a clothing store in Los Angeles before he owned a series of businesses in the Oakland area. So we're not sure about dates exactly, but Belinda Burton Watts says that she and Sal first got together when she was 19. So this would be roughly 1969, 1970 or so. And Sal was living in San Francisco and hanging around in Oakland, visiting friends there at the time. She remembers Sal at that time as a skilled gambler and somebody who always had money to spare. After they got together, they moved to Los Angeles for a short period of time, and that's when we assume he opened his business there. But then they moved back up to Oakland and settled down, and Sal bought the house that you see in the film, a beautiful house on supports overlooking a canyon located on Greenview Drive in the hills on the east side of Oakland. Belinda says they bought this house new from the developer, and records show that the homes in that neighborhood, most of them went on the market for the first time in 1972. These homes tend to be in the 3,000 to 4,000 square foot range, and today they routinely sell for more than $2 million when they go on the market. So as Belinda describes it, once they returned to Oakland, Sal Watts began buying and establishing a series of new businesses. Now, first and foremost among these businesses was Mr. Sal's Fashions, a men's clothing store in Oakland, which also apparently had a manufacturing facility on the same site, upstairs in the same building where the clothing was created. And this was on Telegraph Avenue, which is a really well-known street that runs all the way from downtown Oakland to the UC Berkeley campus. We've become so accustomed to buying clothing these days that's made overseas in places like China. Even all American brands like Levi's are made overseas now thanks to cheap labor and the ability of huge textile mills to scale up production. But back in the 1960s, as much as 95% of American clothing was made in the USA, compared to just 2% now, according to some estimates. In Sal Watts' day, there were stores and companies like his in cities like New York and LA, Chicago, San Francisco, and yes, Oakland, in the fashion districts of those cities where original fashions were designed and made and sold, local brands. And so not everybody wore the same thing. Have you ever gone to work and found out that one of your coworkers was wearing the same exact shirt that you bought at Target? That probably didn't happen as often back then. Look at Sal's shirt here. We can see some really wonderful vintage clothing in this film. Men's fashions with these colorful shirts with big wide collars, bell bottoms, flares, slacks with the Sansabelt type elastic waistline so they didn't have to wear a belt, maxi coats. Fashion is such an important part of the black action movies of this time period. The clothes here, incidentally, are items from Mr. Sal's Fashion, a bit of product placement. And the fashion designer for Sal's clothing business was Jesse Strange. And Jesse also designed not only the men's fashions, but also the women's fashions, including the TWA flight attendant uniform that you'll see at the end of the film. He designed hats, accessories, etc. Wardrobe and costume design are, of course, so important to any film, but for this particular type of movie, the fashion sense is integral. And so many productions of this type took an all-hands-on-deck approach to the fashion and to the costuming. Superfly, for example, one of the most famous blaxploitation movies, the fashions for that film, which are super iconic, they were designed by Nate Adams, who was a friend of the leading actor Ron O'Neal, and Nate Adams appears in the movie with a substantial part. So in this type of film, fashion, music, as well as time and place, the locations where this type of movie are typically shot, if blaxploitation is to be considered a genre, then it's these elements that are the crucial characteristics, because they define how the films sound, how they look, what their politics are. With a few rare exceptions, certainly it's not the screenplays and the stories and the characterizations that make this type of film immediately recognizable. For the most part, these are rather ordinary gangster or crime or private eye stories, but it's worth remembering that these films' very existence amounted to a political act, an act of rebellion against the Hollywood system. Even when studios began hiring the first black directors of the late 60s, Gordon Parks, Melvin Van Peebles, Ossie Davis, chief among them, they were only allowed to make movies under the supervision of white studio heads and producers. They weren't making their own movies per se. They were making black movies that the studio deemed safe enough for general audience. Whereas a movie like Solomon King is really a big middle finger to all of that. So in the early 70s, Sal Watts begins opening and buying businesses in Oakland. In addition to the fashion store we just mentioned, he had record stores, an arcade, an ice cream stand. He had commercial real estate. Apparently there was also a restaurant. And then by 1973, he had expanded to open 2 more Mr. Sal's fashion stores. They were in the Bay Area cities of Palo Alto and Mountain View. He was active in the community as well. In July 1973, the Oakland Tribune newspaper published a story about the Sal Watts Youth Organization, which he and some partners had formed to help underprivileged kids learn leadership skills and just generally have a place to get together off the streets. The article was actually about a trip to Disneyland that Sal paid for 76 kids who were bused from Oakland to Anaheim for a nice little trip. In 1972, 1973, a new television station went on the air in the San Francisco Bay Area, KEMO Channel 20, a UHF station, and its focus was local community affairs and entertainment programming. In the late 60s, with the changing racial dynamics, a number of African-American cultural programs were produced on local and public television stations around the country, most notably the public TV program Soul, which was hosted by Ellis Hazlip out of WNET in New York, which had everything from live music to poetry to political roundtables, a highly influential show. So perhaps inspired by this very show, Sal Watts went to KEMO TV and he became the producer of a show that was initially called Soul Is. It was a music and dance and sketch comedy and variety program for the black community that was hosted by a man named Jay Payton. Now, Jay Payton was a major local celebrity in the Bay Area. He was an MC, a master of ceremonies at live music clubs that primarily featured black artists in both San Francisco and the East Bay. Jay Payton was born in 1925 in North Carolina, and he made his debut as an entertainer in 1947 as a tap dancer at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. And then, after serving in the Korean War, he headed to California. And from the late 50s and through the 60s and 70s, he emceed club gigs and concerts by everyone from Billy Eckstine and Dorothy Dandridge and Johnny Mathis to Count Basie, Red Fox, B.B. King, Lou Rawls, many, many others. Now, the TV show Soul Is, which became the Jay Payton Show, it featured appearances by local artists from the Bay Area as well as national acts, acts that were maybe on tour coming through town. And Jay Payton appears in this film, later in this film, as the MC during a nightclub sequence. You'll notice him as the dapper-looking guy with the dark glasses and a flair for words. Again, many of the people in this film are friends and colleagues of Sal Watts. By the way, Jay Payton previously appeared in another Oakland-based film, The Mac, a much more famous blaxploitation film that was also shot on the same streets and was released in 1973, about a year earlier than this film. We'll talk more about the Mac in a little bit. The Mac is the story of a man who becomes a powerful pimp running the prostitution game on the streets of Oakland. And there's a big scene with an event called the Players Ball, a sort of annual Chamber of Commerce type dinner where all the pimps and their women get together. And Jay Payton appears in that film as MC of the Players Ball, a big scene in the movie. And he announces the winner of the Mac of the Year award. He was also credited as a technical advisor to the Mac, and that film was actually written by a friend of Jay Payton's, an ex-convict named Robert Poole, who had been a former pimp who supposedly wrote the first draft of the script on a roll of toilet paper in his cell at San Quentin. Now, this film is ostensibly a revenge drama, but you'll notice in scenes like this one, there's a lot of, let's say, downtime or meandering. And let's face it, writing a good screenplay is not easy. It's something that takes often years to develop the craft. So it's not as if somebody could easily switch from being a retail businessman to a screenwriter, just as it probably wouldn't be very easy for a screenwriter to suddenly become a retail businessman and entrepreneur. And so with Soul Is, later The Jay Payton Show, and another program called Sal Watts Presents, for a brief time, Sal became something of a local TV mogul in the Bay Area. And he used these programs to promote and advertise his businesses, to promote his fashion line and so forth. And the story, again, is that through his TV programs, he was hearing feedback about the negative stereotypes in black action films. And he hatched the idea to make a film of his own. One other factor influencing his decision was his friendship with the comedian and actor Mantan Moreland, who was a guest on Sal's TV programs and who became a personal friend. Sal's wife remembers that Mantan would hang out at their home, and he encouraged Sal and told him a bit about how the movie business worked and convinced him that he could make a film of his own if he wanted. Now, Mantan Moreland was, of course, most famous for playing Birmingham Brown, the big-eyed chauffeur in the Charlie Chan pictures for the Poverty Row Monogram Studio in the 1940s. Mantan Moreland had been in show business since the 1920s, starting on the Chitlin circuit, vaudeville-type shows, then as a comedian in Harlem nightclubs, then performing on Broadway, and then breaking into movies in the 1930s. He had, by this time, suffered a stroke in the early 60s, but he was still performing. He was making occasional guest appearances on shows like Adam 12 and The Bill Cosby Show, the first Bill Cosby Show where he played a high school coach. And Sal had wanted Mantan Moreland to appear in this film, but Mantan passed away before that could happen on September 28th of 1973 in Los Angeles. By the way, this gentleman in red, who makes a rude comment about the princess and then they get into a fight, that's Sal's brother, John. By the way, the character of Sheila in this scene, who we just heard the band singing a song about her, this is Tanya Boyd, who is not featured in the credits. She's not named in the credits of this film. This is one of her very first professional appearances, and rare among the cast members in this film, she went on to have a really good career and appeared on lots and lots of television programs for decades. Belinda Burton Watts relates to us that Sal was an activist in his own quiet way. In her words, he was doing his best to, quote-unquote, get some sense into our heads. In other words, what I think she's saying is that by offering himself up as an example of a self-made man who was unafraid to put himself out there, by creating this character who's a good guy, who doesn't do drugs, doesn't disrespect women, he was setting an example, and more than that, she relates that through his businesses, it was important to him to create jobs in the black community. And through his charitable organization and other work, he was trying to give something back rather than just make money. And on that note, she says money really wasn't all that important to Sal, although in his heyday, he certainly apparently did not want for money, and he had access to capital for his business projects at a time when many people of color did not have access. Sal was very conscious of this image of himself, and when the film was released, The press materials contained a biography of Sal that emphasized this story of him as a self-made businessman and movie producer. So I'd like to read a couple of short excerpts from that bio to give you an idea of how he wanted his personal story to be framed. And remember, this was written in 1974. Not too very long ago, an Oakland, California businessman answering to the name of Sal Watts decided he would try his hand at becoming a movie producer, and while doing so, add another dimension of quality production and story concepts to black-produced motion pictures instead of capturing exaggerated overplays of sex and sensationalism in celluloid footage, then passing the same on to black audiences the world over as a great new black motion picture seeking their approval, or their support, Now, several months after his undertaking to produce a first-class quality movie whose major stateside scenes were filmed around the Bay Area of Northern California, thereby creating employment and acting opportunities for any number of Oakland residents, including a special appearance by renowned athlete Tito Fuentes, Sal Watts is ready to premiere his modern-day action-packed motion picture entitled Solomon King. In the idiom of the movie industry, Sal Watts has done it all the hard way, but nonetheless, he has accomplished what he set out to do, and the finished results speak for themselves in comparison to the better quality black motion pictures attracting throngs of moviegoers and entertainment seekers. By the way, black action films are often known for their quotable dialogue. I'll give you a few examples from some of the more famous films, but frankly, a lot of them involve the N-word, and we want to mind our P's and Q's here. If I had to pick one scene in this film that is memorable for its dialogue, it's this one here. Little Jamie Watts playing Manny gets off some of the best lines in the entire picture here. And his pronunciation and enunciation of the word bullshit is quite classic. Let's talk a little bit about the city of Oakland. When discussing Oakland, inevitably, people still bring up the old cliched quote from Gertrude Stein, there's no there. Quote is usually used dismissively. It's an insult to the city. And in fact, the city fathers took it so personally that sometime recently they quite cleverly erected a big public art sign or display at the border along the city limits between Oakland and Berkeley. And in big letters it says, there. But I think, or I believe, Gertrude Stein has actually been misquoted or misinterpreted. She originally wrote that line in a piece in which she was expressing nostalgia for the Oakland neighborhood where she had grown up as a small child. And upon returning there some years later, she had found that her childhood home was gone and that the area was unrecognizable. There's no there. Nevertheless, it has fed this misconception about Oakland that there's nothing special about it, that it's just the ugly stepbrother of San Francisco across the bay. But really, nothing could be further from the truth. Certainly, the city has had its challenges. It has at times been considered a dangerous place, but its history is rather rich. Oakland was a city that was on the national map in the early 1970s at the time of this production. For instance, the Oakland A's were a dynasty. They won the World Series 3 years in a row in 1972, 3, and 4. And these were great teams, the years of Catfish Hunter, Reggie Jackson, and Raleigh Fingers. The Oakland Raiders finished in first or second place in the AFC West Conference every year. The Warriors were NBA champs in 1974 and 75. But more importantly, the city of Oakland was a focal point of Black American politics, an epicenter of the Black Power movement for the better part of a decade. This scene certainly references the Black Panthers without naming them, and I'm not sure why this shoving match quickly escalates into brutal gun violence where everybody in the bar gets killed except for seemingly Sal and Jamie. By the way, there was a gentleman earlier in the scene with a violin case, if you noticed. That person is Charlie Walker. And he originally had a larger part in this film, but it was cut out or reduced. But Charlie Walker was a famous person in the Bay Area at this time. In 1971, there was an oil spill when two tankers collided under the Golden Gate Bridge, a massive oil spill on the bay. And Charlie Walker was an out-of-work truck driver who somehow got the contract to clean up the oil spill, to supervise this massive cleanup project. And yet, because he was black, he faced all kinds of resistance to his authority. Local businesses, agencies, community members didn't want to cooperate with him because of his color. They didn't believe he was in a position of authority, and yet he persevered and became a local hero. And in fact, there is a 2022 documentary about his story. Back in the late 1800s, when Oakland was just a tiny little town, it became the western terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad. And so the population exploded with new arrivals, including African Americans who worked as porters and maids and cooks and waiters on the trains. Oakland survived the massive 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and even more people moved across the bay while San Francisco was rebuilding. Oakland was still a mostly white city until the Second Great Migration. Tens of thousands of African Americans left the Jim Crow South for Oakland and the West Coast for good jobs during the war years, jobs in the construction of military bases. A big Chevrolet auto assembly plant was in Oakland. There were canneries, docks, shipbuildings. The city's port became one of the busiest in the country, and it still is today. A black middle class emerged in Oakland, and the historic 7th Street corridor became the center of black business and nightlife. The city had a legendary jazz scene for many years. After the war, as economic growth began slowing, there was competition between whites and blacks for jobs, which began to foment racial tensions. And during the 60s, Oakland's reputation as a city of drugs and violence grew. And this is when the Hells Angels chapter there was wreaking havoc. And the Black Panther Party was formed and made West Oakland their national home base in 1966. The Oakland Hells Angels attacked Vietnam War protesters. They were raided numerous times by the Oakland police in investigations for murder and gun and drug trafficking. They were bad news.
Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you wanna get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
But truly, no political group or protest group brought America's racial conflict front and center, and no group was more divisive in the 1960s than was the Black Panther Party for self-defense. The party's defiance against police brutality, their rhetoric, their advocating of armed self-defense for the black community, all of this had much of white America on edge, and it brought brutal attacks and violence from police departments both in Oakland and around the country where the Panthers established local chapters. In October 1967, Huey Newton, who was the co-founder and Minister of Defense of the party, he was involved in a traffic stop in the middle of the night that led to a gun battle with one police officer left dead and another wounded, and Newton suffered a gunshot wound to the side. Huey Newton was charged with first-degree murder, and his trial at the Oakland courthouse in 1968, just shortly after the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, this trial was a major point of racial tension in the 60s. Huge crowds of protesters chanting "Free Huey" gathered outside the courthouse, and the National Guard had to be brought in to maintain order. Huey Newton's lawyers argued that he'd acted in self-defense, and they actually manipulated the jury selection process to have a jury that was mostly women and with a black foreman, which was unheard of at that particular time. Ultimately, Newton was convicted of a reduced charge of voluntary manslaughter. We mention all of these events because they were part of the recent past. They were part of the public consciousness at the time that Sal was making his movie. More recently, over the past 50 or so years, Oakland has matured into more of a culture city with lots of great music, restaurants, art galleries. Jack London Square and the Marina are lovely. There's Yoshi's legendary jazz club, which is still there. The hip-hop scene there has produced a lot of great artists over the years, including Too Short, one of my personal favorites. But Jerry Brown, who was the former and future governor of California at the time he was elected mayor of Oakland in 1998, he led a rather controversial redevelopment plan for the downtown area that has brought in a lot of big modern apartment buildings and displaced many longtime residents who were at or below the poverty line. And this gentrification of Oakland has certainly changed the character of many neighborhoods. The city used to be an affordable alternative to San Francisco, but today, as we're recording this commentary, August of 2022, the average home price in Oakland is now over $900,000. So as you can see, when Solomon King was in production, the city of Oakland was still living through a period of intense racial conflict and violence. In many of the major black action films of this period, the Shaft, Superfly, the Mac among them, there's a conflict between the main character and a black power type group, similar to the Black Panthers, who challenge the protagonist because they either feel he's sold out or because his motivation is capitalism rather than revolution. It's interesting that Solomon King takes place in the epicenter of Black Power, but Sal Watts really doesn't seem too impressed with the movement. There's a scene in the bar, the scene we just saw a few minutes ago, where the white guy comes in attempting to recruit a group of black nationalists. Apparently he's working on behalf of Prince Hassan, who wants a bunch of black American militant mercenaries to go to the Middle East to help him lock down control of his country. Forget for a moment how ludicrous this sounds. And when Solomon overhears this, he tells the guy, the days of Uncle Remus are gone. In other words, he seems to think the revolutionaries have sold out. Not sure if this reflects Sal Watts' actual opinion of Black Power at this point in time, but it's something of a reversal compared to how the subject is treated in other movies. The actor in this scene is a real-life minister. In fact, I believe he was the minister of Sal's church. And this scene really cracks me up because the gentleman can't even be bothered to sit up in bed or much less stand up, even though these people are intruding on his space. Now, a number of significant movies have been shot on location in Oakland in recent years. A few that come to mind are Sorry to Bother You, which is a really innovative and interesting movie that uses the Oakland setting for more of a imaginary, futuristic version of Oakland. Blind Spotting, and of course, importantly, the film Fruitvale Station, which is the breakout film of the great actor Michael B. Jordan, and it's a story based on a real-life police shooting of an unarmed black man at an Oakland BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit station. The film version of Moneyball was partly shot on location in Oakland, but back in the late 60s, early 70s, while there were lots of movies being shot on location across the Bay in San Francisco, which is, of course, a very picturesque location. For example, the Dirty Harry movies, Bullet, The Laughing Policeman with Walter Matthau, Play It Again, Sam with Woody Allen, Petulia with George C. Scott and Julie Christie. There are two Sidney Poitier movies where he reprises the role of Virgil Tibbs. In particular, there's a movie called The Organization, which I think is quite good. And the list goes on. But you can really count on one finger the number of significant films shot in Oakland at that time, probably owing, at least in part, to the racial tensions and the reputation for violence. We are talking, of course, about the Mac, which we'd be truly remiss if we didn't touch upon, because these two films basically or almost crossed paths in Oakland. Both of them were independent productions shot on location for very little money. But while Solomon King faded into obscurity, the Mac, which did really well at the box office during its initial theatrical release, the Mac has attained and maintained bona fide classic cult film status. The Mac is about a car thief, Max Julian, in the character of Goldie, who rises up through the underworld to become the meanest and most successful pimp on the streets of Oakland. And he uses mind control, this strange mind control device, to manipulate his women. It actually sounds weirder than it really is in the film. The Mac was certainly a more professional production. It was directed by Michael Campus, a socially conscious filmmaker who had covered conflicts and protest movements all over the world as a documentary filmmaker before he'd started making feature films. And before filming began, in the interest of authenticity, Campus reportedly went up from LA to Oakland and spent some time among the world of pimps, conducting research to give the film a sense of realism. He developed a friendship with Frank Ward, who was one of the Ward brothers, who were siblings, I believe 3 siblings, who apparently dominated the pimp game in Oakland at that time. And then the film stars, as we said, Max Julian, who was a respected actor as well as a writer and producer in his own right. And he was also a personal friend of Huey Newton. And so where Solomon King essentially avoids, sidesteps, ignores the Black Power question, the production of the Mac had stepped directly into a conflict between the Ward brothers and their criminal enterprise and the Black Panthers, who had recently at that time declared that they would clean up the gangsters and criminals off the streets of Oakland. And because the director was palling around with the pimps, the Black Panthers felt that he had taken sides, and so they attacked the production. They rained bottles on the cast and crew when they were attempting to shoot a scene on location. And Harvey Bernhard, the producer of the Mac, ended up having to cut a hefty donation, write a hefty check to the Panthers Charitable Fund in order for the shoot to continue unharassed. File this under unintentional humor, I think. For a man who is a former CIA agent, who's trained in cloak and dagger stuff, and who is supposed to be seeking revenge for the murder of his girlfriend, he spends a lot of time moping around, and in this scene he actually seems like he has fallen asleep in his office. Again, the actress playing the messenger here from the bad guys, she was Sal's real estate agent, and I actually think she does a nice job. But Sal walks right into a trap. Again, for a person who has had this type of training, he seems a little naive. Anyway, we'll cut him some slack. If we had to choose one film from the original blaxploitation cycle, and we're talking, dates are usually open to debate, but we're basically talking 1970 to 1975. If I had to pick one film from that time period that would be a kindred spirit to Solomon King, I would probably choose Rudy Ray Moore's Dolomite. Now, it might not be immediately obvious. Dolomite is a far more outlandish film, and it embraces its tacky, vulgar comedy. We've actually seen old press clippings where Solomon King is referred to as a comedy. But even though there are definitely moments of humor in the film, I do not think that Sal Watts intentionally made this as a comedy. Nevertheless, I can see a number of interesting parallels between these two movies. Both are the brainchild of the person playing the title role, and in both cases, that person, Rudy Ray Moore and Sal Watts, had never made or appeared in a film previously and really had no acting experience on camera. Both men were entrepreneurs of sorts. Rudy Ray Moore was a comedian and a singer and a nightclub MC. And at the time he made this film, he'd been self-producing a series of comedy albums, which he'd initially sold by driving around the country and selling them out of the trunk of his car at gigs. Both movies are very violent, and both feature, shall we say, not always the most convincing stunt work, and yet in both cases, the star of the film does some of their own stunts, which is interesting. Both feature a mix of professional and non-professional talent in front of the camera and behind it. But again, like the Mac, Dolomite is a major cult classic, and Solomon King is not. And one key difference may have been that Rudy Ray Moore was singularly focused on his movie. He didn't have other businesses and other ventures that he was involved in really at that time. Even before he had a distribution deal, like he did with his comedy albums, he traveled the country four-walling the movie until it became such a hit in the black community that distributors wanted in on it. It became a big hit, even though by 1975, when Dolomite came out, the blaxploitation phase was pretty much over and done with. The nightclub scenes in this film and the nightclub scenes in Dolomite are another common thread. You really don't see those kinds of scenes in any other black films of this type from this time period. And Rudy Ray Moore has said that those scenes were intentionally inserted into his film as a throwback to the old Chitlin Circuit days and to the race films of decades earlier, when the story would be interrupted by some sort of a production number. And I really wonder if Sal Watts was thinking the same thing. Sal would have been roughly the same age as Rudy, a little bit younger, I believe, but it's very likely or possible that he would have seen a lot of the same types of films when he was growing up. And who knows, maybe he was also influenced by them and tried to recreate that sort of atmosphere. Personally, I'm not 100% comfortable using the term blaxploitation to describe this type of film. Blaxploitation is a term that was apparently coined by the Hollywood trade press sometime in the early 70s. It was a clever shorthand, much the way Italian westerns were called spaghetti westerns, or the Russ Meyer type of films were deemed sexploitation. Exploitation films, they exploit their audience's penchant for sex and violence. So in that sense, the term blaxploitation does make sense, but many of the filmmakers and performers of this type of film objected to that word because they felt it implied that black people were being exploited in yet another way. I would further add that blaxploitation has become a rather meaningless term because it has sometimes been used to label and lump together any and all films about African Americans made in the early 70s. Sweetback, I would say, is not an exploitation film. It's an art film. Lady Sings the Blues is not an exploitation film. Neither is Sounder, but I've seen them all on video store shelves in the past lumped into the blaxploitation category. So at any rate, with all the money being made by Shaft and Superfly and so forth, there were dozens and dozens and dozens more blaxploitation films made to capitalize on this fad, on this phenomenon. And many of these were very, very poorly made. So there was this overkill factor that burned out the genre. And then you had the political opposition from pressure groups like the Coalition Against Blaxploitation, which was formed by the Beverly Hills Hollywood NAACP chapter in the early 70s to call out negative stereotypes in these films and also to demand black oversight of things like scripting and casting. And as you can tell, this group was using the term blaxploitation as a pejorative. Sal Watts had attended Catholic school in Mississippi, and he reportedly chose the name Solomon King because King Solomon was one of his favorite biblical characters, biblical figures. King Solomon, of course, was gifted by God with infinite wisdom. According to Belinda Burton Watts, her memory is that this film was shot in sequence, which is kind of unusual. Again, she appears in the very last scene of the movie when the TWA airplane is being boarded, And she recalled that at the very end of the production, the end of the shoot, the cast and crew drove down to Hollywood from Oakland to shoot that scene on the interior of the airplane on a rented set at the Desilu Productions lot.
Give me JR 34599, please. Hey, Solomon, we just heard 2 shots. I think I see someone coming out now. Okay, cool. All right. He said for us to follow.
This young actress who has just gotten stiffed by Solomon, no pun intended, sorry, is Samaki Bennett. And as we mentioned earlier, she was an employee of one of Sal's businesses. And despite being a non-professional actor, I think she turns in a really nice performance, and she has a certain charisma and charm. The camera likes her. According to a report in Box Office, the trade paper that was published back at that time, Solomon King was made over a period of 2 years, and it had a budget of $140,000. We don't have confirmation on those numbers. However, it appears that a lot of the filming must have taken place in the fall of 1973, October, November 1973. There was a report in the Oakland Tribune, for instance, on October 17th of 1973 about the police being called out to the intersection of Castro and 9th, just west of downtown Oakland, where Sal and his crew were shooting one of the big gun battle scenes in the street. Very likely the scene that we're about to watch here in just a moment. Residents there had called the cops because they feared that the gunfire was actually real. A columnist for another local newspaper included a short excerpt from an interview with Claudia Russo, the actress playing Princess Oniba, in November 1973. She had just finished filming her scenes in the film, and as it turns out, Claudia Russo is a stage name. Her actual name is Shelley Babcock. And doing a little additional research, we found out that she has at least one other film part in the film Hollywood Man with William Smith from a few years later. Solomon King had its premiere at the Paramount Theater in Oakland on September 20th of 1974. And after that, it went into regional bookings around the country. It played in the fall of 1974 in the Bay Area, in Los Angeles, and continuing through the winter and into the spring of 75, it played Chicago, Texas, numerous states across the South, in New York. It had a fairly wide release. In some markets, it was billed with other films, including Uptown Saturday Night with Sidney Poitier and Bill Cosby, Willie Dynamite with Roscoe Orman and Diana Sands. It appears, though, to have received very, very few, if any, critical reviews. In 1977 to 78, the film was re-released to second-run houses in many of the same territories. And at that time, it had a new title, Black Agent Lucky King. And there were new posters and marketing materials that were created. But after that, it appears that this film just sort of dropped off the face of the cinematic earth. If the comments that are posted on internet message boards are to be believed, then it appears that there may have been at least 1 or 2 revival house screenings of Solomon King somewhere in the United States during the intervening decades. But this Deaf Crocodile release is the first legitimate home video release that the film has ever received. At the time that Solomon King was released, Sal Watts announced that his production company, which was called Stage Struck Productions at that time, that they would make a second feature film titled Challenge. This was actually mentioned in their press materials. Supposedly, the title Challenge was the name of the main character once again, and that character was a hitman, quote, hired to create confusion in the mafia, unquote. Not sure what that means. Sal Watts told the press that this new project would be cheaper and made faster than his first film. That project, Challenge, never apparently materialized. The only other film that Sal was involved with that we are aware of is a 1978 independent comedy titled Big Time, starring Christopher Joy, Roger Mosley, and Jane Kennedy and others. And it's another very, very low-budget movie, probably most notable because the executive producer was Smokey Robinson, who also wrote songs for the soundtrack, despite the fact that this was an extremely low-budget film. Robinson reportedly put $500,000 of his own money into the film, and he was later quoted as saying that it was the biggest financial mistake of his life. This long shot in the outdoor restaurant seems to suffer from some focusing issues, unfortunately. Thankfully, it's brief. Now, we're back with Weinstock. Now, Weinstock, if you think about it, is the true villain of the story. He's the one who's been orchestrating all this bloodshed and mayhem on behalf of Hassan, the prince. And in a few moments, we'll learn of Weinstock's terrible fate, because the prince isn't a very loyal guy. He doesn't take failure very lightly. It's interesting that the prince in his palace far away in the Middle East looks like he shops for furniture in the San Fernando Valley. Very nice drapes and a nice sofa there. The question really must be asked, why didn't Sal Watts make another film? He obviously released this film rather widely across different territories within the United States. We don't have figures about the box office returns, but nevertheless, he did find distributors for his product. And one would have thought that he would have been bitten by the bug and wanted to try again. Well, we don't know the definitive answer, but it may have just been that he became more involved in his many business ventures. Making movies, of course, takes a great deal of time and energy and money. And Sal, of course, had many different irons in the fire. So that's one theory. Sal also became, at least briefly, immediately after the release of this film, a little bit more deeply involved in the music business. Having owned record stores, he graduated to owning his own record company. The soundtrack for this film, which is notable for the instrumental funk theme that plays really on a loop under the opening credits as well as various scenes. The music was by Jimmy Lewis, an arranger and producer and composer. And Lewis had been a former member of the Drifters and also a frequent collaborator with Ray Charles in the late 1960s as both a songwriter and producer. And he even recorded a duet with Ray Charles titled If It Wasn't for Bad Luck, which was released in 1969 and actually charted on the R&B charts. By the way, here is the cameo by Tito Fuentes of the San Francisco Giants. Coincidentally, or perhaps not coincidentally, there is also a baseball scene in The Mac, the film that we were talking about earlier. I'm not sure what the connection is, but in any case, these children that are shagging flies and fungos, those are, again, some of Sal's kids. Now, I know it's not customary in an audio commentary to just stop talking and to tell you that I'm just going to stop talking. But this scene that we're about to watch is so unusual, it's so indescribable that I don't even know what to say about it. And yet it's mesmerizing, it's fascinating that it even exists, it's incoherent, and yet it's totally engrossing and fascinating. And I think we should just take a moment here to watch a bit of this scene, and then I'll resume.
She's well known around the town. Her clients couple miles around. Yeah. She's a love healer. That's Sister Sheila. They call her Sister Sheila. Yeah, yeah, yeah. She's a love healer. That's Sister Sheila. One friend told me that he had been sick, looked so good and you wanna steal her. That's Sister Sheila. But it ain't no casual taxi, no. You leave her room, your mind is still she's a dealer. That's Sister Sheila. To wait till turn takes some time. But when you're through, you jump back.
Among Sal Watt's many business entities, during the making of this movie, he and his friend Jamie Watts, who had a background in music and was a gospel singer, and who, of course, is playing Manny in this film, they formed a company called Sal Wah Enterprises. That's Sal/Wah, W-A, Enterprises. This company was to oversee all of their entertainment-related ventures, and as part of that, they created a small record label, Sal Wah Records, which released the film soundtrack LP. In 1975, they hired an experienced record label professional named Warren Gray, who had previously been with Bel Canto Records, which was a label that put out LPs by people like, for example, Martin Denny, the artist who is perennially popular with the Lounge Lizard crowd, Louis Prima, same, Lawrence Welk, not so much, and Spike Jones, a real range there of artists, and there were many others, and they were active in the late 50s, early 60s. And Sal and Jamie's plan was to become a player in the record business. This was at a time when record distribution and sales were a mix that was similar to the way the movie business was structured, with major companies with major recording artists and wide retail distribution compared to lots of smaller, sometimes fly-by-night distributors who had artists who were locally and regionally popular, and their records might not be in the big chain stores like The Warehouse or Music Plus, but there were hundreds of artists like this in local record stores, particularly in the ethnic neighborhoods of big American cities like LA, New York, Chicago, etc. However, it appears that Sal Wah Records only put out a small handful of releases in 1974 and 1975, including the film soundtrack LP, which is now super rare if you can find it. There was a new single by the old group, the Coasters of Yakety Yak fame, and also a couple of singles by a band that appears in this film. The band is called Papa's Results, and they appear in the nightclub singing the song Sister Sheila. Sal reportedly also later managed a record label called Marcel Records around 1976. By the way, the song that the secret agent Samaki sings in the nightclub when she's working undercover, supposedly following Solomon to keep him safe, that song is titled Changes, and it was written by Jimmy Lewis. And in the tradition of Audrey Hepburn and Marnie Nixon, the song, well, the vocals were provided not by Samaki, but by an LA nightclub singer named Helena Hollins. The actress did not sing the song herself. I'm also fascinated by this sequence of the film. Clearly, Sal Watts wanted to have his film go out with a bang, and clearly, well, we know he was a fan of commercial movies. Belinda Burton Watts told us that they would go to the movies and watch every major black film that came out. But we also got the strong sense from things we've read that Sal was just, in general, a movie fan. And so, again, The Longest Day, Guns of Navarone, these types of films, which were popular in the 1960s, it looks like he's trying to create his version of something like The Dirty Dozen, a big raid on a compound, complete with all the booby trapping and explosions, pyrotechnics. It's just fascinating that this sequence really kind of comes out of nowhere. The CIA director, or the regional CIA director, apparently in this universe, the CIA has a regional headquarters in Oakland, which is fascinating. But the CIA regional director basically gives Solomon carte blanche to go out and conduct a raid on a foreign country on his own. There doesn't appear to be any U.S. active military involved in this operation. It's a fantasy, of course, but it's fascinating to see what Sal Watts was able to pull off in terms of a big action sequence with a teeny tiny budget. And we can only imagine what he might have attempted to do had he had something more approaching a real budget. There's one more story concerning the city of Oakland and the synergy between the city of Oakland and black cinema, specifically in the time period that we're talking about, specifically in 1974, the year that Solomon King came out. And it's the story of the Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame, and we'd really be criminally negligent if we didn't cover that as part of this discussion. Now, perhaps Sal Watts' timing was unfortunate. It certainly was unfortunate to release a film of this type after groups like the Coalition Against Blaxploitation had been railing in the public eye against the content of black films. Even if Sal was trying to do something different, something positive, something better, it wouldn't have mattered because these films had all been labeled with the tag of blaxploitation. So as a result of that politicking by these protest groups, as a result of the overabundance of these films and the corresponding decline in overall quality, this new market, this supposedly new market, the black audience, which had miraculously and suddenly appeared out of nowhere and been discovered by Hollywood, well, suddenly that market was drying up because the audience was tiring of the same old, and they were looking elsewhere at different types of films for entertainment. The big box office draws of this genre were in the rearview mirror. Films like Cotton Comes to Harlem, Sweetback, of course, Shaft, Superfly, and The Mac, and even Cleopatra Jones. All of those films had done really well at the box office, but starting really around 1972 and 3, the popularity of these films at the box office was really tapering off pretty quickly. So this movie, in order to be successful at the box office, it probably would have had to be something really exemplary, something really especially good and polished, or perhaps something especially bad, so bad that it's good, something along the lines of Dolomite. But I think what Sal Watts was attempting to achieve with this film, in a positive way, largely doing it by himself, it's a quite admirable attempt and achievement. So in February 1974, Black History Month, the very first Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame awards ceremony was held in downtown Oakland at the Paramount Theater of the Arts, which coincidentally, a few months later would be the venue for the premiere of Solomon King, as we mentioned earlier. Now, the Paramount is a 3,000-plus seat Art Deco movie palace and concert hall. It's beautiful. It was built in the 1930s. It also hosts the Oakland Symphony at the present time. And the Hall of Fame was formed by a number of nonprofit and arts organizations in Oakland that banded together with the purpose of uplifting black cinema. They recognized that there had been tremendous growth and strides in black films in recent times, and improvements in the way black people were represented on the big screen. So their annual awards show, which incidentally was broadcast on local Bay Area television, This was essentially a Black Oscars telecast, a Black Oscars ceremony. It was called the Oscar Michaud Awards in honor of perhaps the most important Black filmmaker of all time. And these awards shows featured appearances by all the major African-American actors of the time period, and also historical figures, people who had appeared in films and in Black theater for many years and decades. Now, the focus was really on mainstream Hollywood, not independent cinema. So they never thought to honor someone like Sal Watts. But wouldn't it have been nice to recognize the achievements of an Oakland native who embodied the very spirit of what these awards represented? That's taking nothing away from the Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame. This is an amazing organization that, as we said, carried on for more than 20 years. Now, in 1974, think about it. They obviously were responding to the explosion in Black cinema, but this is also a period when, apart from Sidney Poitier in Lilies of the Field and Isaac Hayes' Oscar for the soundtrack to Shaft, Black representation at the Academy Awards was nearly non-existent. The Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame was an antidote. It was a counterbalance to the ignorance and the ignoring of the Black contributions to cinema by the Academy. And so at the Oscar Michaud Awards, in addition to Oscar-style awards for best performance and things like that, every year they would induct new members into the Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame. And this included not only present-day talent, but also important people who had made contributions dating all the way back to the silent movie era. So in addition to people, present-day people at that time, like Ossie Davis, Sammy Davis Jr., William Marshall, Juanita Moore, Gordon Parks, Bea Richards, Yaphet Kotto, Godfrey Cambridge, Raymond St. Jacques. There were historical figures, people like Vincent Tubbs, who was a Black publicist, Paul Robeson, of course, it goes without saying, the actor Clarence Muse, whose contributions have for so long been ignored. There was Lillian Cumber, as a person you've probably never heard of, but it was so important. Lillian Cumber was the only Black agent in Hollywood during the 1960s. And if you were an up-and-coming Black actor and you needed representation, you went to Lillian Cumber, and she would often handle you in your formative years. And if you were lucky enough to be eventually handled by William Morris, you would eventually move on. But she was instrumental in the careers of so many performers coming up in the 1960s. Joel Fluellen, Lorraine Hansberry, of course, the playwright and screenwriter, Rex Ingram, Quincy Jones, James Earl Jones, Eartha Kitt, Abby Lincoln, Hattie McDaniel, Butterfly McQueen, Frederick O'Neill, Joseph Wilcots, another name you've surely never heard of, but he was one of the very first Black cinematographers in Hollywood. The contributions and the way the Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame celebrated the art of cinema and the Black experience is something that I feel should be recognized and cherished. If you go to YouTube, you can find a couple of taped broadcasts of these award shows from back in the day. And the Black Film Center Archive, one of the biggest archives of information about Black cinema in the world, located on the campus of Indiana University, that archive has a tremendous amount of information and materials on the Hall of Fame. Well, we've reached the end of the story, and here are Belinda Burton Watts, who's been such a big help to this Deaf Crocodile restoration project of Solomon King, along with Sal. And the way Belinda relates the story, Sal Watts seemed to have lost his fire, his hunger, his sense of drive, and his business empire faded away. He lost much of his holdings in the 1980s and 90s. At one point, she says that he did some time in the federal prison at Lompoc, California for tax evasion. And after living, as we had explained earlier, with one kidney for so many years, he finally had to start taking dialysis treatment. He suffered a stroke late in life, and for his last years, he was bedridden. Sal died in 2003. His reported age at that time was 63, though he may have been a little older, as the year of his birth is a little fuzzy. And this film is his legacy. It's a lasting testament to one man's tenacity and drive. And I'd like to thank Dennis Bartok and Craig Rogers of Deaf Crocodile for resuscitating this film, for reviving it, and for inviting me to come and to talk about it. And thank you for listening.
Hello and welcome to Tumbleweeds and TV Cowboys. My name is Hunter. In this podcast, I'll be joined by a different guest each week to discuss a classic Western movie or TV show. I've been a fan of classic Westerns for as long as I can remember, and in recent years, they've become very nostalgic for me. I love the aesthetic, the tropes, and I love seeing different filmmakers' takes on them. At their best, they're incredibly entertaining, rewatchable, and some of my all-time favorite movies are Westerns. We'll mostly focus on Western movies made in Hollywood, but we'll also be covering spaghetti Westerns, and one thing I'm very excited to get into are Western TV shows. I've got some amazing guests coming on the show, film professors, historians, and podcasters. And Tumbleweeds and TV Cowboys is part of the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network, and many guests on the show will be from other shows on the network. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening. To hear more shows from the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network, please select the link in the description.
Having a life scholarship and being able to afford to go to college made me feel inspired to go.
When I got a life scholarship, it was such a relief.
I knew that I wanted to have an impact. Having a life scholarship through the SC Education Lottery was huge. It gave me the opportunity to make that impact right here at home.
The South Carolina Education Lottery. A better you, a better us, a better South Carolina. Visit sceducationlottery.com/betteryou.
Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you wanna get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.